the radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Monday, December 23rd. Slowly approach Christmas. Hope everybody had a fantastic weekend and looking forward to a Christmassy week. So today we're going to talk about China. But we're going to talk about China from a particular perspective, which we haven't talked about really before, I think. And this is inspired by and sponsored by Alex Epstein, who this is what he wants, right? So if I were advising the Trump administration right now, what would I advise their China policy be, right? It has to be realistic, not realistic to Trump, but to what is possible with America, with what is possible in any administration. It doesn't have to be compromising amount of it, but within the world in which we live, within the context, what would be possible? What would I advise them? So it has to be practical advice, and it has to take into account kind of the concerns that many people have about China, legit and illegitimate concerns that they might have, and we'll talk about both of those. So we're going to approach the whole China question from a particular framework, and this is also going to be how we approach immigration next Monday. And I expect I'll try to apply the same thing to healthcare. I think it's the week after that. So I think it's really useful. And the idea here is, could somebody take this show and flesh out the material and document it and do all of that and basically write a position paper for the Trump administration, for any administration, in terms of, okay, what can we do with China? What is realistically possible? What should be done? What could be done? And why? So that is the perspective we're taking today. I think it's fun and should be really interesting and intriguing, I think. And hopefully, maybe, you never know, useful to somebody right out there who might be actually in a position to advise the Trump administration about things like China. Certainly, you could argue that Alex has had some pretty good success, really good success, with his advocacy for a particular perspective on energy, and that has become significantly. It has become a dominant position or a significant position within the Republican Party and within this administration. So let's see if we can at least create a structure, at least bring up the issues and present some solutions to the problems that might arise vis-a-vis China. So this is very much a policy orientation for today's show. All right, so given that, we're going to jump in a minute. I'll just remind you that you can ask questions. You can ask questions, of course, always about anything. I do give priorities to questions that I asked about the topic we're talking about, in this case, China. So if you've got any questions about China, anything related to China, militarily, economically, politically, logistically, trade-wise, what I predict will actually happen versus what I'm going to say should happen, all of that, I think would be super interesting. I mean, it would be a way for you to basically shape the show. That is, you ask the questions that interest you, and I will respond to exactly those questions. And that way we'll cover the things that you would like covered. All right. I mean, this is going to be a little different, and this should be good. Wanda Freeman just gave up 15 minutes of workout to be here. Cool. I won't get your heart racing quite as much as a workout, but hopefully we'll get those brain cells working, that'd be good. All right. So what should be America's China policy in this Trump or any other realistic administration, as the world is today, given people's general perspectives about the world? Well, the first question I think we want to ask is, why do we need a China policy? That is, I think we need to frame the context of what's going on, and here I think it's important to note what people's concerns are about China, and given that that the United States has to do something about it. China is population-wise probably the second largest country in the world. It's got a population that is 4 times larger than the United States, or in the ballpark of 4 times larger than the United States. It is a country that has gone through incredible economic growth in the last since 1978. So you do the math. Incredible economic growth. To the point where China today's economy is really huge. It is on a PPP, that is a standard that adjusts for purchasing power parity. It is as big, if not bigger, than the U.S. economy on a absolute just dollar amount number. The U.S. economy is still significantly larger, but as adjusted, it's a massive economy. It's clearly the number 2 economy in the world in terms of just its sheer size. Now, it's 4 times larger in terms of population, so the population is still poor, relatively speaking, relative to the United States or most we'll call Western countries. But it has a large economy. It's more than just a large economy. It has become the manufacturing center of the world. I read somewhere that something like 45% of all the stuff manufactured, produced in the world is manufactured in China. Now, I don't know how they define all these things, and I don't know if that's an accurate number, but 45%, that's a huge number. They are the world's producer of stuff. As a consequence of their size and just the sheer volume of wealth, money, that they have created, they have a relatively large military budget. And again, given that even though it's significantly smaller than the United States, it's still the second largest military budget in the world. And it is much cheaper to do stuff in China. So again, purchasing power parity. If you adjust for purchasing power parity, I'm just not sure how much smaller it is than the United States. It's probably still is smaller than the U.S., but it is large. They have invested a lot of money in their military. China also has ambitions. It is an ambitious country. It is a nationalist country, much more nationalist than it is communist. And in being nationalist, it has ambitions with regard to its neighborhood, with regard to Asia, in particular East Asia, but generally Asia, the seas around Asia, the oceans around Asia. China believes that it, as the leading civilization in Asia, should dominate Asia. It should be the hegemon. It should be the influencer over East Asia and over the sea lanes all over Asia. And it has taken some aggressive acts in order to actually express that. And you see that, of course, in its battles with the Philippines and with Vietnam and the South China Sea. The South China Sea, by the way, is named after China, not accidentally, right? It is the dominant player over there. China also would like to have influence over the entire region and into Central Asia. So on the other side, on the western side of it, it would like to have there. And then finally, China has a territorial claim against Taiwan. It claims Taiwan is part of China, and it wants to reunify with Taiwan. So China is a big player in Asia, and Asia is a massive economic powerhouse and a massive, trading partner with the United States. The United States has significant interests in Asia. The United States has allies in Asia, from South Korea to Japan, to Singapore, to Philippines, to some extent Indonesia, Malaysia, and certainly if you go further south to Australia. And if you think about, more broadly, India and the Middle East through kind of the shipping lanes that go through South and then Eastern Asia. So the United States has an important interest in keeping those shipping lanes open, keeping those shipping lanes available to U.S. trade, and keeping the U.S. Keeping that area not dominated by another power that might seek to thwart U.S. interests. The U.S. also is concerned about, of course, the military buildup, that China could be potentially a threat to the United States. So we have to have a China policy, because the United States today is the dominant power in the world and has been certainly since World War II, arguably since World War I. Maybe even before that, maybe arguably since the early part of the 20th century, even though nobody knew it. The United States has been the dominant economic power, the dominant military power. It had a conflict, obviously, in World War II, but then a conflict with the Soviet Union, which it came out of it victorious and has been a dominant power has been the sole really dominant power since then. China has nuclear weapons. A confrontation with China would be very, very ugly. And China is an ambitious nation. So we have to watch ourselves, and we have to have a policy on how to deal with them. Finally, we should add, and I think it's implied and everybody knows this, China is an authoritarian state which abuses the individual rights of its own people. But more importantly, for our purposes, authoritarian states have a tendency to expand, to become aggressive, and to seek, to engage in warfare. Their authoritarianism does not necessarily stop at their borders. They tend to be aggressive rights violators even outside of their borders. So for all of these reasons, given the size and importance of China, it is probably the number one foreign policy priority of the United States. The United States has Russia to deal with, true, and but it has allies that can help it deal with Russia directly, immediately in the vicinity, and that is basically Europe and NATO. The United States could easily decrease its participation in NATO and expect the Europeans to pick up the slack. Europe is relatively rich and able to deal with the Russian threat. Russia, of course, also is a declining power, a shrinking economy. There is no real future for Russia as a global power, as a global influencer, whereas clearly there is for China. The United States also has the Middle East to deal with, but again, the Middle East is pretty backward and primitive, and if the United States was serious about dealing with the Middle East, it wouldn't take that much. And the Middle East, while it possesses one resource, oil and natural gas, the China represents a far bigger potential threat to resources, shipping lanes, trade, and ultimately peace that the United States seeks. All right, so this is why we need a policy. It's just China's just there, and it's big, and it's influential, and it's a dominant player. It's the other dominant player in the world other than the United States. Nobody comes close. The Russian economy is much, much, much smaller, and Russia is a dying state. Versus China, we'll see. But China at least is still growing, and China just has bulk and size that cannot be matched. Okay, so that's kind of why we need to deal with it and why we need to have a policy. But what should a policy actually address? What are the issues that I think most people worry about, most people legitimately or illegitimately are concerned about in terms of China? Well, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, what we want to do in any China policy is find a way to reduce or eliminate the security threats from China without crashing our economy or triggering a war. I mean, if we were to put it in one sentence, that would be it. We want to reduce or eliminate the security threats from China without crashing our economy or triggering a war. Now, I think we have more concerns than just that, but that would be how I would put it in a succinct way, primarily because the reality is that, you know, the main issue that foreign policy needs to deal with is the potential for security threats and their elimination, the protection of individual rights of Americans and the elimination of threats to them, or the pacification of those threats. And China represents a threat. It needs that, in that sense, it needs to be eliminated. But without war, because China's a nuclear power, with a lot of nuclear warheads, and without crashing our own economy, without us having to sacrifice in order to achieve some goal. And you know, and the question is, of course, is that possible? So let's break it down a little bit to some of the objectives a China policy would have, right? So I think one objective, and if you take Trump's perspective on foreign policy, which is true, one element of his, you know, sometimes he says things that are true, and that is peace through strength, which I don't know if Trump has ever said, but people in his orbit say a lot. Peace through strength. One of the ways in which you prevent a war, and one of the ways in which you eliminate a security threat from anybody, is by making it clear to the other side that a war would be devastating to them, that they would, without question, lose such a war. So in other words, the way to avoid a war is to deter your enemy from ever doing anything that would lead to war. Particularly given that the United States is not going to initiate war against China. What we fear is China initiating war against the U.S. or an ally of the U.S., Taiwan being the obvious one. So the first thing one has to do is make sure, and this is again the kind of the thing that worries people, is the policy we come up with has to be one that prevents China from superseding the United States militarily, where China does not become the superior military force. It should also prevent China from unification with Taiwan. Or again, this is one of the real concerns people have, and we can talk about whether unification with Taiwan is good or bad. Elon Musk, I think today, came out with a statement basically saying, look, Taiwan to them is like Hawaii to us. Of course they want to reunify with it. And in a sense, who are we to stop them? That was the implication. So people are concerned about this. Elon might have this nonchalant view of China unifying with Taiwan, but there are real strategic, economic consequences to the United States from Chinese unification with Taiwan that could lead to war. And of course, there is the question of a free China or authoritarian China and a free Taiwan. How do we view that, and what should we do about it? So we want to prevent China from superseding us militarily, prevent China from unification with Taiwan. So one concern people have, another concern from an economic front, is we want to prevent becoming dangerously dependent on China. So we want to prevent the United States from becoming dangerously dependent on them. For example, if they dominate production of essential materials that we need in the United States, and if they can just stop that, whether at a time of war or just about any time of their choosing, then, that becomes a problem. They could cut us off. Right now, they're basically cutting the United States off from a couple of rare earth materials that are essential for electronics businesses. So, what do we do about that? So that seems to be a legitimate concern people have about the Chinese economy. What about the fact that they manufacture 45% of all the stuff out there? How much of that stuff is stuff we in the United States really, really need and would have a really hard time replicating if they cut us off? Now, whether that's a legitimate concern or not, we can talk about, but it's certainly a concern people have. So their dominance of world manufacturing is increasing right now. They are using this dominance, or what some economists call overcapacity. We can talk about, whether there is such a thing, but overcapacity. Their overcapacity to basically dump means sell it below cost, a product into the rest of the world, thus bankrupting companies in the rest of the world who sell the same stuff, thus increasing the dominance of Chinese manufacturing. And maybe today they manufacture 45%. Is it something to worry about? Or how do we deal with? How does a China policy deal with the fact that maybe one day they'll be making 50, 55, 60% of all the stuff? For example, in the pharmaceutical industry, there's concern about a lot of the stuff the pharmaceutical companies use comes from China. Is China a bottleneck? Can China unilaterally basically stop the global supply chain of various companies, of various important industries for the United States? People are concerned about China stealing intellectual property of a variety of different companies. And a prop-up China policy needs to address whatever legitimacy there is to this idea. At the same time, a policy needs to be very cognizant of the fact that we do not want a nuclear war with China. A nuclear war with China would be kind of the war that end all wars, because it'll end all civilization. It would be an unmitigated disaster. China has a lot of nukes. We have a lot of nukes. China-America war could easily deteriorate into World War III with Russia as well. And then, life on Earth is at risk if in a nuclear confrontation. That is something that needs to be avoided. And of course, at the same time, if part of this policy involves somehow disengaging with China, shifting production elsewhere, restricting trade with China, if such a policy were to include all that, then we need to be able to do it without creating an economic disaster in the United States, because there's real fear that whatever we do with China, we're dependent on them. We can't do without them. And if we try too hard to disengage or to have a rational policy towards them, this is going to completely collapse the economy, and we can't have that. And then finally, I think a policy with regard to China has to take into account two other elements. One is basically the benefits we get from trading with the Chinese people, insofar as they're not using the benefits from that trade to come after us militarily, to sabotage us, to steal our stuff, and to do harmful things. But there is an incredibly productive population there that is incredibly entrepreneurial, that is incredibly motivated, that works really hard, and that if you understand trade and you understand a win-win relationship with trade, we as America would benefit enormously. We as Americans would benefit enormously if we could trade with them, if we, the American people, as individuals, could trade with them, the Chinese people, there would be an enormous benefit to both sides. And finally, how do we encourage, and this relates to the previous point, how do we encourage a pro-freedom reform in China? How do we get them to dump authoritarianism, thus become less of a threat to the United States, thus become a better, more beneficial, dramatically more beneficial trading partner with us? How do we increase the benefits of trade for both by liberating China, by making China, by encouraging China to adopt pro-freedom reforms, and ultimately moving China from the authoritarian camp, from the authoritarian category, to free to semi-free, category that I think the United States and the West belong in. So these should be the goals of a China policy, addressing these particular concerns. Now, I want to say something quickly about our current China policy, both the Biden, Trump, and to some extent, Obama and Bush policies toward China. But particularly, I want to talk about Trump and Biden. I think the current policy is driven by a number of irrational views and irrational goals. Much of China policy today is driven by fear. Fear not only of China militarily overtaking the United States, but fear, which I think is irrational, that China economically overtakes the United States. The reality is that China, if it was a free country, for example, if it economically overtook the United States, that would be a good thing for the United States. It would result in a great trading partner. But it doesn't seem to be a caveat about what kind of China we're talking about. The assumption is that they are always going to be our enemy, and there is deeply embedded in particularly the Trump administration, but also in the Biden administration, this idea that China is an economic enemy that needs to be constrained from growing economically. Not just because of its military side, but for just from the economic perspective. And here, and this is true particularly of the Trump administration, of Trump himself, there is clearly a view that economics and trade in particular are a zero-sum game. If China becomes big, America becomes smaller. Trade is viewed as, and we've seen this in how Trump talks about us subsidizing the Canadians, trade deficits are viewed as subsidies rather than trade being win-win. So, we have to find a policy towards China that does not view the world as zero-sum and does not view other people's economic success as a threat to you. The contrary, their economic success is a benefit to you, again, other than the military issues. We also seem to have, and this is true for the last few administrations, we seem to have a military strategy vis-a-vis China that is stuck in the 20th century. A military strategy that is built on a land war or on a sea war that is dominated by aircraft carriers and by big boats, by big ships. It is a military strategy that is not taking into account the completely changed nature of the war, of warfare as such in the 21st century. If you want to see what warfare in the 21st century looks like, even in the sea, just look at what happened to the Black Sea fleet of Russia Black Sea Fleet of Russia was a mighty force with significant firepower, big boats, big ships, big guns, big missiles. And yet, it faced the Ukrainian Navy with basically nothing. Nothing. And the Ukrainians have decimated the Russian fleet. Decimated it. There is no Black Sea Fleet. And to the extent that it exists, it sits in ports far, far away from the conflict, afraid to take to the sea. And the reason for this is that you can take down a major, big ship with a land-to-sea missile, with an air-to-sea missile, particularly if it's hypersonic, but certainly any type. You can take it down with a drone, and you can take it out with a drone boat or a drone submarine. And indeed, the Black Sea today is dominated by drone boats, unmanned boats of the Ukrainian military, some of them suicide boats that just ram into the ship and blow it up. So it's not clear militarily that having lots of aircraft carriers in a world where you cannot reliably shoot down hypersonic missiles, in a world where you cannot reliably detect small drones or submarine drones, is a viable strategy. One of the things that needs to happen, and I don't have a sense that it's happening in some places in the military, in some places in the Defense Department, but it's not clear to me to what extent it is really being embraced by the new administration, is you need a new military strategy. You need to rethink conflict. And you need to have to think about the fact that any conflict with China is going to be basically seabound. It's all going to be in the ocean. You don't need tanks. You don't need artillery. But what you certainly do need is something to knock down hypersonic missiles, lasers maybe, I don't know. You need lots of drones. You will need lots and lots of drones. We'll get to that in a minute. You're going to need ocean-bound drones. You're going to need submarine drones. You're going to need a lot of stuff. It's cheap, but you have to be able to produce a lot of them. Much cheaper, for example, than the big, massive, gazillion-dollar aircraft carriers. So part of the irrational policy we have today is just military strategy. The Pentagon is a slow-moving monster that has to get realigned. And it better get realigned quickly. Better get realigned quickly. There are a lot fewer legacy interests in the Chinese military than on the U.S. military. And then, current policy today is basically crippling. We cripple ourselves. We put ourselves at a disadvantage in so many regards, in regards to regulations, regards to things like egalitarianism, DEI, ESG, woke in business, multiculturalism. We have no confidence in our own values. So how can we have a policy that is self-assertive and confident and wanting to, in a sense, dominate the sea lanes and preserve trade when we don't really think our own culture is worth anything, is any better than anybody else's. And of course, now, and I'd say both with Biden and with Trump, we've got nationalism, the abandonment of freedom, individual liberty, in the name of some common good. And this manifests itself in just stupid industrial planning, which basically is trying to copy the Chinese rather than using what made America strong, what made America successful, but trying to copy them, which is industrial planning. Or, for example, immigration restrictions, again, under the nationalism, immigration restrictions which restrict the ability of incredibly talented, smart, fantastic people from coming to America and contributing and adding to the productive capabilities of this country in terms of its ability to defend itself and to project its power outside of the United States. And of course, in trade restrictions, where we believe that everything should be made in the U.S. and buy local and buy American and all this silliness in the name of nationalism. So we're crippling ourselves in the policies we have towards our own economy, towards our own country, and how we're organizing it. And then finally, I'd say the final aspect of this, what is the rational policy that we're pursuing today? I really do fear this, that the way we talk about China, the way our policy makers talk about China, and the way they engage in their attempts to, deter China, is actually leading us towards conflict with China. Without really being prepared for that conflict and without kind of the deterrence that conflict should, make possible for us. So, for example, I do not think it is helpful or useful or a good way to think about this to talk about Cold War II. We're not in a Cold War with China. We have massive trade. We have massive engagement with China, which we did not have with the Soviet Union for very good reason. Now, whether we should or should not is a good question. But the reality is we're not in a Cold War II. We're in something different. But to draw those kind of analogies is unhelpful. And then the constant rhetoric about World War III, the constant rhetoric about the inevitability of a war with China. Add to that the complete ambiguity and purposeful ambiguity, particularly on the part of Trump, with regard to whether we would defend Taiwan or wouldn't defend Taiwan. Biden was much better on this. He basically said the U.S. would defend Taiwan. But Trump is not. And Elon Musk today, or at least I saw the video today, basically suggested we shouldn't, that it belongs to China. What the hell are we even interfering? Right, so current policy towards China, I think, is mostly harmful. There are a few good things. We'll talk about them as I make certain recommendations. You can see that it is similar. Wonder Freeman says drama, drama, drama. That's right. Instead of policy, instead of a coherent, rational policy, what we have is drama, drama, drama. Headlines, clickbait, drama. Instead of a coherent, clear, explicit, known policy. This is our policy regarding China. We have a lot of drama, and a lot of it irrational, or most of it irrational, and most of it guided by fear rather than really by thinking through the issues. All right, so let's talk about the policy changes that have to be made. I'm going to make, 8 kind of major policy recommendations and break them down for you. And of course, each one of these could be a paper. This whole talk could be a book. You could write easily a book about China policy and what China policy should be. So this is going to be quick and it's going to be kind of big picture, and some of it I'll break down more, some of it I'll break down less, some of it I know more about, some of it I know less about. But these are the areas in which we should really be focused, right? So I think the most legitimate concern that we have is a concern about the Chinese military and a concern about the potential weakness of our own. I think we have seen with Ukraine, we are struggling to supply them with weapon systems. We're struggling to supply them with ammunition. We just do not have the capacity to keep up with a hot war, particularly, we've got Ukraine, we're supplying Israel, and we are struggling to do both. And if you add those two up, that would be smaller. The two together are smaller than what we would have to deal with if we were dealing with China. So the first thing we have to do, the first policy agenda needs to be, how do we make the United States military overwhelmingly better than the Chinese? How do we make it overwhelmingly better, period? Dominant globally, and therefore a deterrent to China, but the side benefit of that is a deterrent to anybody who has ill will towards the United States. So what is needed in order to do this? So first, we have to develop a clear military strategy for deterring Chinese aggression. We have to make it such that within a few years, China will look at the United States military, the United States Navy in particular, and say, ugh, we don't want to mess with that. We don't want to mess with that. We're just going to back off of whatever military plans we had, because if the United States deploys that military, we can't handle it. We can't handle it. And of course, do so in a scalable, cost-effective way. We're not going to bankrupt the United States. We're not going to dramatically increase our defense budget. We have to do it in a way that's reasonable financially. We don't need a World War II buildup. We're not in a war. What we need is a way to make our military so powerful, so much better than anybody else's, and so strategically smart that they will think twice, or at least delay indefinitely any kind of hostility that they might have planned. And it's not about throwing more money at it. So here I think it's important to ask the question, what is ultimately the United States' advantage over over China and over really any country in the world? And so step one, what is our advantage? What is the thing that makes it possible to build weapon systems that will guarantee our military superiority? And the advantage here is that because we live in a free country, we have entrepreneurs and businesses that are more innovative than any entrepreneurs and businesses in the world. And they have the freedom to innovate. They have the freedom to try new things. They have the freedom to create stuff at a pace, at a rate that is just unimaginable anywhere else. It is the exact opposite of the Biden administration and I think the Trump administration's attitude, which is we need central planning. We need to throw a lot of money at chips. We need to throw a lot of money at X, Y, Z, whatever the thing is, and that's how we're going to create innovation. No. I mean, what the United States has is a system called freedom, called capitalism. As constrained as it is, that makes innovation and progress successful without, free of, well, because it's free of government intervention, government money, government subsidies, government controls, industrial planning, central planning. In other words, if we want to have the best weapon systems in the world, if we want to have U.S. military superiority, what we need is to unleash the innovators. We need to unleash is the entrepreneurs. In other words, the military needs to find ways to better capitalize on Silicon Valley. In the 21st century, what will dictate who wins a war is who has the superior technology. And the superior technology is likely to be in the hands of those who are free if their freedom is really unleashed, if they're truly free. So we need to capitalize on American ingenuity and productiveness, which is a consequence of American freedom and American capitalism. What we need is more capitalism. But what we also need is a military and a Pentagon and a Defense Department, which has as its maybe top priority, if not top priority, close to top priority, the integration of Silicon Valley into the Pentagon. In the sense that right now, the Pentagon is a massive, unbelievable bureaucracy. It takes forever, and forever I mean years, to approve new projects. forever to approve new weapon systems, forever to consider something new and radical and different. We have an antiquated system of procurement of weapons, mainly with checks and balances to prevent fraud and bureaucracies to prevent abuse that basically make it impossible to really innovate and bring in new weapon systems into the system. As a consequence, we have like 5 big companies that produce most of the military's hardware. 5. They compete among themselves. And those 5 has all kinds of ways in which they influence the process. And basically, they are interested, these big 5, in big weapon systems. They love F-35s, which cost billions and billions of dollars. They love big aircraft carriers that have multiple systems and big stuff, right? They love the big stuff. But the reality is that in the world we live in today, what we need is a lot of small stuff. We need technology. We need drones. We need AI deployed in the battlefield. We need to be able to deploy technology quickly. We need to innovate fast. We need to be able to upgrade software almost instantly. I read a story about, what was it? It was during the Iraq War, like at the beginning of the Iraq War, F-16 pilot literally did not have a GPS map in the F-16. Right? You could get a this is in the early 2010s. You can get a tablet, and he did. This pilot tells the story. He got a tablet with a GPS and a map, and flew with the tablet to tell him where he was, because the plane itself did not have. You know, and upgrading that plane cost a fortune. But we need to be able to do that quickly and effectively. We need to be able to bring the kind of mentality of Silicon Valley and the speed of Silicon Valley to the Pentagon. And that means we need to break the bureaucracy. And yes, anti-corruption is important, but not that important. Not that important when you're trying to, when you have to redo the military, when you have to really upgrade, when you have to much more important is to be cutting edge. Much more important is to have the right tech. Much more important is to bring in the right companies. This is, you know, whether it's Plantier, whether it's, was that company that Palmer Luckey has, there are now, for the first time, Silicon Valley companies embedded in defense contract. We need a lot more, and there could be a lot more. That means that the Pentagon has to be in Silicon Valley. It has to willing to buy products. It has to be willing to buy products quickly. It is Silicon Valley that would produce, look at Starlink, right? It will produce Starlink-like products, much, much more powerful and meaningful satellites. It will produce much, much better unmanned boats and unmanned submarines and things like that. It's not going to come from Boeing. We know what Boeing can produce. It's going to come from a Silicon Valley company. And therefore, the United States, the military has to be able to procure, pay, sign contracts with these companies quickly and effectively, not take them over, not nationalize them, God forbid, right? And the costs are lower. And much more important, the cost lowering, you create a much, 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 much better, military. One of the Freeman says, Boeing, oh my God. Yeah, but Boeing is one of those 5. Boeing is one of the main producers of military hardware. All right, so that's one. We have to be able to unleash American ingenuity and productiveness, not just in consumer electronics, but also in electronics that bolsters our military. This is our comparative advantage. This is our competitive advantage. This is how we dominate China. China's authoritarian. China's centrally planned. And therefore, China will always be behind the United States. If we unleash this, always be behind the United States when it comes to tech, when it comes to cutting edge, when it comes to deploying that tech and cutting edge stuff to the battlefield. And China must know this. We should let them know. Then we have to create an industrial capacity to sustain us if there's a war. That is, you have to think about how to make sure you have the goods to be able to run a war without depending on supply chains that are running through China. Now, that does not mean industrial planning. It does not mean, investing in the United States so that, but it does mean using the Defense Department and Defense Department funds smartly. For example, paying a drone company in the United States, not to build drones, to build drones that the U.S. military needs today, but to actually build capacity to build 100X drones in a time of war. I've talked about this in steel. Build plants and mothball them, and then make sure they're upgraded every year so that they have the latest technology. Spend money, and it'll look like waste. This will look like waste. Elon Musk and Vivek will want to cut this because it'll just be empty plants sitting there. But that's how you make sure that when we need them, the capacity is available. Now, you do not want to just have them, subsidize their building plants. What you want to do is pay them some minimum fee to keep the plant available, to build it and keep it ready for the day when you need to produce. And then a commitment to buy, of course, everything you need. You also want to do this not just in the United States, but you could do it anywhere in the friendly world. You could do it in Mexico, you can do it in Canada, you can do it in Europe. So there's a variety of different ways in which you can assure the productive capabilities to engage in a war without actually engaging in subsidizing Intel with $100 billion so that they can continue making chips. All right. Finally, and it's not finally because you'd have to spend much more thought and time and develop this idea of how do you make sure that the U.S. military is overwhelmingly better? This is all under that rubric. You have to build strong and explicit military alliances with free Asian countries aimed at deterring China. So that China knows that if it goes to war with the United States, it is also going to war with these other countries. And you want to make it explicit. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Australia, India, Philippines, maybe even Indonesia and Malaysia. I don't know. You'd have to think that through. But countries that are in the region, countries that have or fear Chinese dominance, countries that are motivated to invest in their own militaries and to invest in an alliance with the United States if they believe the United States is serious. And this is why it has to be explicit, and it has to be something like NATO, a mutual defense commitment primarily targeted at China. And because of that, you have to be selective. So certainly you would do Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, and then you have to think about the rest. Do you want the Philippines? Don't you want the Philippines? Do you want India? Not India? Do you want, Malaysia, Indonesia? But certainly Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. And Australia. And New Zealand if they weren't so pacifist. And of course, Japan and South Korea also have something the United States does not have, which is the capacity, for example, to manufacture ships. The United States does not have shipbuilding capabilities, but Japan and South Korea do. So there is complex, the United States does not produce chips, not in scale, but South Korea does, Taiwan does, and Japan could. So there are complements across these countries. Japan has a pretty strong navy. could be stronger. South Korea has a pretty strong military, could be stronger. Australia could be stronger. So what you want to do is have an alliance and then encourage the allies to invest in their armed forces in a coordinated fashion. So play to each party's strengths and thus represent a united force, a significant, large, technically advanced, united force of free countries standing against China if it seeks any kind of expansionary policies. Just like we have such an alliance in Europe with NATO that should have, if we were serious, stopped Russia in its tracks and prevented it from ever thinking about going to war. We need to create the same thing, and better, actually, in the Pacific, in Eastern Asia. So all of that is, I think, a big part of what is necessary. I will mention one other one, which to some extent, I think the Biden administration is engaged in. Trump started, and then Biden has done a lot more around this. This is the one thing that they're good at, and that is the banning, to ban China from accessing advanced military technology produced in the West. And here the primary is chips, microprocessors. The Biden administration has done a lot of work with Japan and the Netherlands and Taiwan to stop selling China the most advanced chips, but more importantly, to stop selling China the tools to produce the most advanced chips. Now, ultimately, China might catch up, but it's probably a decade behind, and probably will remain a decade behind for the foreseeable future without the tool-making devices. So denying China, not tariffs, not trade restrictions, but just a ban. It's illegal to sell these easily used in the military things. So just like we ban certain weapon systems from being exported, you should be able to ban microprocessors, at least the most advanced kind that can be used in military equipment. This will also significantly slow down Chinese efforts when it comes to AI, where the West, if it's proper, could far outstrip the Chinese. We'll get to what would be required in order for them to do that. Okay, let's do, what else do we want to do? Okay, so that's point number one in terms of policy. Point number two in terms of policy. I think decide that Taiwan is strategically crucial to U.S. and Asia. Make a decision, whether that is true or not. I assume it's true. Let's assume it's true. I think certainly with TSMC in Taiwan, right now, there's no question that it is true. TSMC, the microchip manufacturer. And therefore, make it clear, unequivocal. Make a commitment to help defend it if it's attacked by China. And arm it to the teeth in the meantime. That is, make this clear to the Chinese. Right? I think one of the ambiguity is, well, the Chinese might think we won't come to defend them, and therefore they might engage in a war under the assumption we won't. And then we do, and then we're in a war that could have been avoided just by saying we will be in the war. Make it clear that the United States is unequivocally opposed to reunification of Taiwan and China as long as China is authoritarian and hostile to the West. So, again, I think clarity in foreign policy is essential. So make it clear, unequivocal, that our position to reunification, as long as China is authoritarian and hostile. Okay, so that's point two, as it relates to Taiwan. And I think as it relates to really, deter China. China won't invade Taiwan if it thinks that the U.S. will intervene and if it thinks the U.S. has a superior military force But not just in theory, a superior military force that can deal with China, that can deal with the particular issues that China presents, i.e. water far away in the Pacific. Right. Now, China is very vulnerable. China is vulnerable because it is an unfree country. And this is a key to understanding everything about China. China is not free. And therefore, China is going to be slow in innovating. It's going to be slow in applying innovations to its military. It's going to be ineffective. It's not going to be optimal. The human mind does not function under force. And therefore, they cannot match our military if we unleash it, in a sense of unleash innovation within it. They cannot match it. And this is why the Chinese have not invaded Taiwan so far, because they're still too weak. They have numbers. They have quantity. But quality is dubious. We've never seen Chinese weapon systems in action. We've seen Russian, and they're not impressive at all. Much of Chinese weapon systems are built of Russian prototypes, if you will. So we should be skeptical about China's ability to match innovation with the United States. It just does not have the tools. But more than that, China is dependent on scientists and engineers, incredibly talented, smart, but living under an authoritarian regime. They would leave, I think many of them would leave in a heartbeat if they could. I think the United States should make a strategic decision about immigration policy vis-a-vis China. And that is that at the very least, any Chinese with high skills, tech, science more broadly, should be encouraged to emigrate to the United States. And all I mean by encouraged is it should be easy. Now, yes, some of them will be spies, and we should screen them as well as we can to prevent that. But most of them will not be. And as a consequence, what we would be doing is encouraging a massive brain drain from our potential enemy to ourselves. A massive brain drain from China to the United States. I mean, we're focusing right now just on China. We can generalize this when we talk about immigration next week. I mean, Chinese middle-class people are already trying to sneak into the United States through our southern border. Why sneak? Why not encourage them to come? Why not encourage the Chinese, again, particularly engineers, scientists, to leave and thus weaken China's military ability to confront the United States and ultimately economic ability to pay for the military that would confront the United States? All right. Let's now think about some stuff we can do in the United States. So one of the challenges we have with China is that China has today an overwhelming control over many core materials, mining materials, rare earth materials. I don't know. You know, the list is endless in terms of what they have. And they could really choke off the West from these materials, which would make it very difficult for the West to develop, to build, particularly in high volume, any kind of tech advanced weapon systems or any technology. China dominates production of rare earth materials and others. But the reality is that there are rare earth materials and other kinds of materials like nickel and the whole list. I don't have the list here of all the materials. There are deposits of such materials outside of China. There are vast amounts of deposits of these things in Montana and Wyoming. They keep being discoveries of more. There are deposits of these materials in Ukraine. In Scandinavia, they've had some massive finds. In the ocean bed adjacent to Japan. In other words, there are plenty of natural resources in the world, all over the world, but even just in free countries, that if exploited, would dramatically reduce the dominance China has on these resources. So why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we exploiting all these materials? Why aren't we mining for them actively, thus reducing our dependence on China? Well, because we can't. Because of our regulatory regime, the environmental regulations, because of the entire scope of, it's all public lands. They're not private. But primarily environmental regulations. And the fact that we need government permission to mine on the lands, you have government license, you have the whole government thing becomes unbelievably complex. There are all kinds of regulations specifying what can and cannot be done on government land and how many activities can be done at any given point in time and what the leases should be and how they should be, and there's no end to it. So we need to start in America tomorrow. We need to start to change environmental regulations to allow for extensive mining. Get rid of all the regulations that apply to mining. Get rid of the environmental impact studies and the snails that might go extinct. Or maybe if we got rid of the snails, then you wouldn't have to, you could make them go extinct. That would help you move along. I mean, just mine. Build, baby, build. Mine, baby, mine. Drill, baby, drill. That should be the motto of the United States. And we should be doing that wherever we find and wherever it's economical. Now, it's economical because China dominates these. They're squeezing. Prices are high. There are lots of mining companies that would love to mine in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Sweden, Norway, off the coast of Japan. Mongolia has a lot of this. Now, Mongolia is very close to China. It'd be hard to do anything in Mongolia without the Chinese trying to dominate. We need to develop private property laws for extracting resources to accelerate this process and ultimately, over time, but only in conjunction with getting rid of the environmental regulations, we need to privatize public lands, particularly those lands that are resource rich. We need to take away the whole issue of how public lands are being used for private profit. No, make them private lands. Get people to buy the land that they're mining, to buy the resources. So we need to encourage by pulling back, by deregulating, by getting out of the way. We need to encourage mining. Right? So that's a first and simple thing to do. It's hard because all the special interest groups and the pressure groups and leftists and the environmentalists and all this other stuff. And I'm sure there are a way to get rid of the regulations, the environmental regulations, without turning the place into, I don't know, a place that pollutes all the water and all the air in the region. There are smart ways in which you can protect air and water, clean air and clean water, while still allowing, and indeed American companies have developed amazing mining technologies to make that possible. So unleash American entrepreneurs onto our natural resources. But more than that, we worry about industrial capacity. We worry about our tech capabilities. We worry about all this stuff vis-a-vis China. China dominates the production, the manufacturing of stuff. They have a tech industry. They do all this stuff, and we worry that in a war, if they cut us off or if we try to disengage with them, we will go without things that we need in order to survive. So how do we increase production in the United States? How do we increase tech? How do we increase business? How do we increase the creation of value in the U.S. economy? Well, we know how to do this. Freedom brings about economic growth. Freedom brings about wealth and value creation. We should move aggressively across all industries to deregulate across all industries, because the government shouldn't be choosing and deciding who the winners and losers are, who should be deregulated, who shouldn't be deregulated, all of them. And we should be comprehensive in our deregulation. That is, it shouldn't just be specific laws regarding specific industries. It should be labor laws need to be eliminated or loosened up. We should be able to hire easily and therefore fire easily. Actually, it's the other way around. We should be able to fire easily and therefore encourage to hire. And we should be able to hire the best talent available. This might, again, link up to immigration policy, which we'll get to in a week. But that would be good if we could bring the best and hire the best. We need to eliminate or at least dramatically modify environmental laws. We need to get rid of antitrust, particularly as it applies to tech, but really across the board. We need to stop all subsidies. We need to stop all subsidies and stop government picking winners and losers. We need to liberate the American industry, bring capitalism as much as possible. Liberate the markets as much as possible. Protect people from crooks and frauds. Protect property rights vigorously. And then let it rip. One sector that is crucial to our defense is energy and electricity. So energy and energy delivery. To make U.S. industry competitive, we need cheap electricity, cheap energy. Again, the government shouldn't subsidize it. All it needs to do is stop subsidizing. Stop subsidizing expensive, unreliable energy. And let the market rip. Find ways to privatize energy. Privatize our power lines. Create property rights systems that provide the right kind of incentives. The right kind of incentives to update our power lines, to increase capacity. We should be aggressively moving towards nuclear energy, particularly to fund, to power these AI server farms that are going to be rising up all over the country. I mean, this is where we have a real competitive advantage with artificial intelligence. So get power to these centers. Now, I see every day almost an announcement of some big tech company signing a deal to receive electricity from a nuclear power plant that hasn't been built, with the hope that they will be built within the next 5-10 years. Do whatever it takes to get rid of the regulations that restrict or make too expensive our ability to produce nuclear power. AI is a crucial strategic advantage vis-a-vis our conflict with China, particularly in its applications in the military. We should do whatever we can to accelerate the deployment of AI, and a big part of that is more electricity, more energy. And then finally, in areas of industry where products are necessary for U.S. military, we need to use defense spending to create potential capacity. potential capacity for chips, potential capacity for missiles, for artillery shells, for ammunition, for whatever is needed, so that when we need to turn it on, it is there available to be turned on, and that the private parties, private companies that produce this are incentivized to keep the production lines ready, even if they're not producing anything. There should be a plan, and hopefully there is a plan somewhere, for World War II style ramping up of production if necessary. And again, all this should be public. We want our enemies to know that we have the capabilities to ramp up and to defeat anybody in a violent conflict. That's how you deter the enemy. All right, we're almost there, guys. I know it's hour and 15 minutes already. But I want to do 3 more of these, and then we'll wrap it up. A lot of people are concerned about the Chinese stealing American IP, intellectual property. Now, first, it's important to note that America doesn't have IP. Specific companies, specific individuals have intellectual property. And the Chinese use multiple methods in which to gain that IP. Sometimes they make it a condition to enter China for companies to hand over that IP to them. Nobody has to enter China. Now, while I think this is despicable and wrong of them, and every form of diplomatic pressure should be applied to them to stop this, if companies are so weak as they want to hand over their IP in order to do business in China, I don't see how the American government can stop that from happening. But there is another way in which Chinese companies get American IP, or American companies' IP. And that is something that they engage with on a regular basis, which is horrific and shocking that we do very little about. And that is the stealing of IP through hacking. Now, hacking, basically the Chinese government using computers to enter into computer systems of American companies and American government and stealing information or stealing IP, that is an act of war because it is done by the state. The state is China. And this needs to be confronted, and this needs to be dealt with in the harshest terms. I mean, initially, any hack attempt by the Chinese should involve the United States doing whatever it can to basically shut down or fry every computer in China. To retaliate with a hack, retaliate with electronic warfare in a way, again, that deters them from doing it again. Now, you don't want to go into nuclear war with them, but you want to make it clear to them, unequivocally clear to them, that you will not tolerate violations of rights of Americans. You will not tolerate mass theft. You will not tolerate breaking into American government computers and stealing data, or American company computers and stealing IP. And it is unbelievable to me that so little is done. We keep hearing news reports about hacking this and hacking there, and they say Chinese government-linked group. And as far as we know, nothing is done. Now, maybe the NSA is hacking them back and doing really amazing things to them, but we don't know about it. It would be nice, again, to make these things explicit. I don't believe in secrets. Very few things should be kept secret. The government is our government. What they know, we should know. And by the way, it's good for our enemies to know what we do. It's good for our enemies to know what our capabilities are if they're significant. Again, it deters them. IP is definitely a legitimate form of property. There's no question it's a legitimate form of property. Ayn Rand has a whole essay about it, but you don't just have to believe Ayn Rand. There's lots of, philosophical proof that IP is. Read Adam Ossoff, read the work of others. IP is definitely property. If IP is not property, then there is no such thing as property. And, the United States needs to basically make it so costly for the Chinese to steal it through hacking that they wouldn't dare do it. Okay, one other one. And this relates, maybe this was in the wrong order, but this relates to, again, the U.S. economy. We want to make the U.S. economy robust and insensitive to disruptions in trade with China, or less sensitive to disruptions in trade with China. That is, if the disruptions to trade with China, it shouldn't be catastrophic. Well, one way to do that, which is win-win, win-win-win. Basically, there's no downside to this, is to basically open up trade with the rest of the world. That is what the United States should do. What the United States should do is basically eliminate all trade barriers to all other countries in the world, certainly to every other free country in the world, and thus dramatically increase trade with the rest of the world. Thus make the United States less dependent on China. If we had zero tariffs with the European Union, and with the UK, and with Latin America, and South America, and Central America, and Mexico, and Canada. So start just with the free countries, but why not do it with everybody? Then the United States would benefit enormously, would diversify its sources of goods. Companies would move to those places that had zero tariffs with the United States, and we would basically take away China's advantage. Now, I would just unilaterally reduce tariffs across the board, including to China, to zero, and you would have ultimately the same effect. We should encourage bonds with other free countries. If we're going to do free trade in stages, we should prioritize our friends. We should have immediately, tomorrow, by executive order, zero tariffs with Europe, Canada, Mexico, South America, and our allies in Asia and Australia. We should encourage our various allies to embrace free markets, free trade, and to deregulate their industries. We should actually go to the Europeans and say, hey guys, want to get rich? Here's the program. Here's how you do it. It's not a secret. Everybody, here it is. Just do this stuff, i.e., move towards capitalism. And I would say we should not stop trade with China as long as they're not an explicit enemy. Once we are basically at war, Cold War or hot war with China, yes, we should block all trade with China. But tariffs make no sense. You ban certain products, and you make everything else free trade. Okay, final point in terms of our strategy, policy, Chinese policy. Make freedom in China and everywhere an explicit goal, not a military goal, an ideological, intellectual advocacy goal. Be a shining city on a hill explicitly. Talk about it. Talk about it. Talk about it. Talk about it. And, encourage, again, through talking, through moral suasion, every other country, China included, China in particular, to become free. And here I want to make, I think, a really crucial point that I think so many people don't get. And, I'm reading a book by a Trump appointee about his kind of China policy. And one of the things he says is China's a threat to the United States, whether it's free or not. And that is just untrue. China is not a threat. China is not a threat if it is free. If it is free, there are massive benefits of trade to both parties. If it is free, we don't care if it's bigger than us or smaller than us. What we care is that it stays free. Its richness makes us richer. Free nations do not go to war. So what we want is a capitalist China, a truly capitalist China, not just in economics, but throughout. And if we can make, or if we can help, if we can promote freedom in China, then the military option goes away. The risks go away. The need for a robust China policy goes away. They become a friend, not an enemy. They become an asset, not a liability. So, to the extent that we have any influence on freedom in China, we should promote freedom. So finally, I want to make this point to wrap it all up. Authoritarianism, authoritarian regimes, countries led by authoritarians are no match as compared to a free people. China is no match as compared to a free United States of America. Not militarily, not economically, not technologically, not by any measure. They're just not a threat if we are free. If we are so rich that they can't come anywhere near us, they can't touch us. If we're just so technologically advanced that they can't match us. So while we cannot control China themselves, we cannot actually impose freedom on China. We cannot change the choices that China and China's leaders are going to make. We can't control everything about ourselves. And that means if we want to protect ourselves from Chinese aggression, if we want to make sure that we can militarily deter the Chinese, that we're militarily significantly stronger than the Chinese, then there's one guiding theme to any policy, and that is increase freedom in America. Make America free again. Oh, there you go. Make America free again. Or make America freer than it's ever been. Indeed, the best strategy to deter China, the best strategy to deter China, and even the best strategy to ultimately make China free is to work to make America free. To work to make America free. Free economically, but free in general. To make America the land of liberty. And if we do that, China is not a threat. So let's focus on what we can do. Deregulate, deregulate, deregulate economically. Liberate, liberate, liberate in every aspect of American life. Embrace capitalism. Make America capitalist again. How about that? Make America capitalist again. Or make America capitalist for the first time. All right. That is my China policy. I'm curious to see what Alex thinks. He sponsored the show, Alex Epstein, but he's also obviously engaged in providing policy advice to the Trump administration. I'd be interested in how he would view this in that context. So I'll let you know if I get any feedback from him. Okay, what do we do now? Well, let's do this. I've got a few announcements. and then we're going to go to your questions, and I'll give priority to the questions that have to do with China. All right. A few things I want to remind you of. First, there is a conference in Florida in a few weeks at the end of January. It's the weekend that is the 1st and 2nd of February. So it's the 31st of January. Where is it? 31st is the Friday. 1st and 2nd of February is Rand's Day. It's a conference. Rand's Day. Rand's birthday is the 2nd of February. And the conference is to celebrate that. I will be speaking there. Harry Binswanger will be there. Peter Schwartz will be there. Don Watkins will be there, and many others. It's going to be incredible. It's going to be incredible conference. It'll be a lot of fun. There'll be a lot of people there. I mean, there's a capacity constraint, so you should sign up. So everybody should sign up for the conference. Bottom line, if you live in Florida, it's a no-brainer to sign up for this conference. It's in Naples, Florida, which is fairly easy to get to. You can find the information about the conference, registration, hotels, everything like that, at Rands, R-A-N-D-S, day.com/2025. Randsday.com/2025. And yeah, Ayn Rand will she be 120? Is that right? Yeah, it's 2025. That's right. Come celebrate Ayn Rand's 120th birthday with us. Again, it's going to be fun. It's going to be educational. It's going to be interesting, and you get to hang out with me and with Harry Binswanger and with Gene Binswanger and with all these other people. It'll be just a lot of fun. So yes, just go to randsday.com/2025. I think Harry. I'm really looking forward to Harry's presentation because he's going to be talking about recollection of discussions he had with Ayn Rand that he's never talked about before. So we'll get real insight into Ayn Rand, directly into Ayn Rand. All right. So that is Rand's Day. I want to remind you that Alex Epstein is a sponsor of this show. And you can access the gold mine that is really Alex's thinking, Alex's knowledge, Alex's taking complex issues and boiling them down into principles and talking points and concretes that you can easily communicate then on to other people as you debate and discuss these kind of issues. You can get all that at alexepstein.substack.com on energy, on environmentalism, and on climate change. So all of that is available. Please consider going to the website and signing up. All right. What am I doing here? 1 second. Finally, or almost finally, the Ayn Rand Institute is a sponsor of the show. And the Ayn Rand Institute right now is encouraging people, young people who've read Ayn Rand's fiction, interested in studying objectivism more deeply, and particularly if they have an eye to being a professional intellectual one day, to come and attend the Ayn Rand Con USA, Ayn Rand Conference in the US, which is in Austin, Texas, February 28th to March 2nd. You'll have a chance to meet and study with prominent objectivist intellectuals such as Ben Baer and Greg Salmieri and many others, and delve deeper into objectivism and explore its application to a wide array of topics. You'll also have many opportunities to engage directly with experts in Rand's ideas, hang out with them, ask questions, engage with them, and of course with other students like you. The Institute is offering full scholarships for this, transportation, room and board, well, maybe not board, but room and tuition. And you can apply. Now, the deadline is January 17th, so you've only got, 3.5 weeks to apply. for this, maybe 4 weeks to apply. So do it. And it's at midnight Pacific time, so that gives you an extra half day if you're in the East Coast. You can apply. You can fill out the application. You can get information about this. Again, February 28th to March 2nd at aynrand.org/start here. aynrand.org/start here. Anybody's interested in deepening their understanding, who would like a scholarship, who is thinking about maybe an intellectual career, but you don't have to be convinced that that's what you want to do. It just has to be kind of an option on the horizon. But we're definitely looking for people who've read Ayn Rand, interested, and want to study her more deeply. So please go and apply over there. All right. What else did I want to say? Yes, I want to remind you of the December 31st show. It'll be a big fundraiser for the Yaron Brook show. Every show is a fundraiser, but this is a big one. This sets the tone for the rest of for the new year. It'll be on December 31st. It'll start at 1 p.m. Eastern time. It'll go for 4, maybe 5 hours. To try to 4 or 5 hours. Why did that go out only now? That's weird. Anyway, until we raise the money, right? So, and we're trying to raise $15,000, which would be pretty amazing if we can reach. So I like to have real big stretch goals, and to encourage you guys to really support the show and to get us rolling into the next year with some energy and excitement and momentum. So please consider joining us. You don't have to come for the whole 4 hours. Just come anytime you can. Join us anytime you can, and drop by, ask a question or two, hang around, enjoy the festivities for as long as you want to. All right, I think the last thing I want to say is just to remind everybody that you can become a monthly supporter of the Yaron Brook Show. You can do so on PayPal, but also on Patreon. And Patreon, if you're a $10 or more contributor, you can also set up a RSM feed so that you can get the Yaron Brook Show commercial free as a podcast. So you can do that with a $10 a month or more contribution on Patreon. So please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or PayPal supporter soon, before December 31st. Set up that monthly thing and then come and make a one-time contribution on December 31st. But then you know that you're set for the rest of the year, because every month the show is going to get a certain amount from you. All right. Let's see. That is finance. We'll do that later. Adam says, CCP has a well-organized influence network across the broader West for censorship, cutting Dae Jang Geum, and limiting the opportunity of anti-CCP, ex-Chinese, etc., etc. What should be done about it? I mean, look, we believe in free speech. I don't think the government should do anything about it as long as it is just speech. But when it devolves into more than speech, threats, intimidation, and actual violence, which has occurred. I mean, the Chinese have these kind of police department offices in major American Canadian cities. Those need to be shut down. If people are intimidating, they should be arrested. Anybody involved in actions that, are threats, intimidations, violence, in violation of American law should be kicked out. If they want to go on TikTok and manipulate the videos, or manipulate the videos on Twitter, anybody can do that. What they cannot do, what they should not be, now Twitter and Facebook and those guys should stop them. I think that should be part of their policy, that state entities, American government, but also Chinese and Russian and other governments, should not be allowed on the platforms, or should not be allowed to manipulate stuff on the platforms. But that should be a policy of the social media. But in every other way, the Chinese should be stopped from harassing. I also think that to the extent the universities get money from China or Chinese entities, they should be required to disclose it. Again, can't stop them from taking the money, as long as we're not at war with China. But you have to disclose it. Everybody has to know. Your other donors have to know. Your faculty have to know. Your students have to know. The same with Qatar. The largest investor, the single largest investor in American universities. Bigger than any single donor, American donor, bigger than anybody is Qatar. They buy whole departments. So that needs to be disclosed. That needs to be up front and center. Jennifer, do you think a military that at least somewhat understands it is fighting for its own freedom would have a better morale than an army fighting for dictatorship? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you can see that with Ukraine and Russia. You can see that with Israel. You could see that with Israel when it was young and poor. You can see that with even World War II. I think the American soldiers were far more motivated than the German soldiers were. So yes, I think that's absolutely the case. The challenges with modern warfare is that so much of the war is happening away from the front line. That is, it's not about, who shoots who. It's missiles from afar, it's airplanes from afar, it's everything from afar. It's drones. It's a lot of drone technology. And that kind of motivation, that kind of energy, that kind of morale is still important, I think, but less important. Less significant. It's more significant to the people developing the technology. All right. Okay, Jim Brown says, the idea you mentioned about American people trading with Chinese people rests on individualism, which is enjoyed by neither culture, especially China's. Well, first, I don't accept that at all, that it rests on individualism. It is a literal fact that when individuals trade or when individuals buy stuff to benefit their own life, and that's what people buy stuff for. Chinese people do that. American people do that. They all do that. They are benefiting from gains from trade. And they might have a different compartment in which they're complete collectivists, in which they're complete statists. But when people go to the mall and go shopping, they're fundamentally buying stuff to make themselves feel or in some way make their lives better. And in that sense, people in America are still individualistic. And in that sense, the Chinese are, I think, as individualistic almost as Americans. They're super individualistic. I mean, one of the things that impressed me most about China was how I think individualistic the Chinese people, as individuals in the frame of their own lives, are quite individualistic. They love to go shopping. They love to dress up. They love to be comfortable. They love their own family. They love having fun. They're very engaged. And in that sense, I think that the Chinese people are, they still need a philosophy. They need ideas. But culturally, China has a lot of the elements that support freedom, that would support freedom. But they need a philosophy. They need explicit ideas. Individualism is the only basis on which to build a society, to build a culture, to build a country, a nation. But the fact that people are not individualistic doesn't mean materially individualistic, philosophically conformist. I don't even think that's true. I think that philosophically, the Chinese primarily, again, the ones I interacted with, subsection, right? And the people I saw on the street and stuff, I would say they're philosophically agnostic. They just don't have one. They conform on some things. They don't conform on other things. But yeah, I mean, they're certainly individualistically materialistic, and that's true of Americans. Americans are also philosophically conformist for the most part and materially individualistic. But the gains in trade are there as long as the trade is in things that individuals value. And therefore, they're gains in trade because they gain something that they value. I don't think you have to be an objectivist to benefit from the gains of trade. Let's see. Yeah, Yeonmi Park says China is keeping North Korea government alive, and without their help, North Korea would collapse. Could pressuring China to stop be a necessary step to move North Korea towards liberalism? I don't know. I mean, I generally think that the best attitude towards North Korea is to ignore them. I don't think they need much of our attention. I think we basically need to ignore them. I mean, to a large extent, I think that's true of China. I think we need to build a military that can easily confront China. We need to make explicit opposition vis-a-vis Taiwan, and then we need to ignore them. And I think the same is true of North Korea. The problem with North Korea, of course, right now is that China is less of an influence in North Korea, and Russia is more of an influence in North Korea. So Russia now is propping up North Korea. But the best thing to do is if we can deal with China, we can deal with Russia, at least challenge both Russia and China, stand up to both Russia and China, that North Korea is a nothing. It's an insignificant blimp, and it we should defang it by destroying its nuclear capabilities. But even if you don't do that, we should have the capability to destroy North Korean missiles before they leave the ground and accept that as the status quo for now. Mindspan Wellness says, is China committing a genocide in the Uyghurs? How about Tibetans? What to do about their situation? No, I mean, again, I don't know what genocide means, but if genocide is the systematic eradication of a whole people, then no, I don't think genocide is being committed in any of the places. I think the Chinese are treating the Uyghurs brutally, horrifically. They're violating their rights. They are putting them in camps. They are torturing them and threatening them and doing what they can to try to change trying to make sure to pacify the Islam. I think they're doing the opposite by using force. But China really has a real problem with the Uyghurs, and that was a decade ago or so. There were lots of terrorist attacks in China perpetrated by Uyghurs who were Islamists. Same problem we have, right? And their solution is brutal. And it's to inflict even, their own people, their own population, innocence. So what China needs is the rule of law. And it's sad and it's horrible that China does that, and we should speak up against it. And the same with Tibet, where they've basically taken over a people's country, and they've settled it with Chinese people. But the problem here is lack of freedom. Lack of freedom for the Uyghurs, lack of freedom for the Tibetans, and ultimately lack of freedom for Chinese themselves. I do not believe that they are trying to exterminate the Tibetans or the Uyghurs, but they are trying to repress and suppress them. And that's bad, and that's wrong. But is that a threat to the United States? No. Is that a reason, for you not to buy Chinese goods? Maybe. Maybe you say, I don't want to buy anything from China because the Chinese violate these people's individual rights so badly. That's an individual choice. That is not the job of the American government. It's the job of individuals to decide who they buy, who they trade with, and whom they don't. And the U.S. government's sole responsibility is national security. Is the fact that the Chinese are pressing the Uyghurs a national security threat? It's not. So you decide whether it rises to the level of, I won't deal with anybody from China or not. Mindset Wellness says, please articulate Henry Hazlitt's argument against tariffs using U.S. China relations as the context. God, I don't remember Hazlitt's exact argument against tariffs, although every argument Hazlitt made was basically a broken window fallacy or the unseen results. And all my arguments, I think, against tariffs have been, in a sense, Henry Hazlitt arguments in that sense. Tariffs are taxes. They're taxes on yourself, on your own people. By taxing your own people, the products that your own people buy, you're raising their costs. You're making the American producers of those products less competitive because they have less incentive to compete, less incentive to drive down prices. You're raising the costs overall. Now, as I've explained, otherwise, a secondary effect of tariffs is to raise the value of the dollar and to lower the value of the yuan in the Chinese context, which actually lowers the price of these goods, but a bigger portion of them now, a bigger portion of the price is a tax. So you haven't really dramatically lowered the amount that Americans will buy, but you have, raised prices and made American companies provide less incentive for them to compete. So at every level that you look at this, you are basically distorting production, distorting trade, distorting incentive, and creating bad investments. So, for example, people might invest in, let's say, I don't know. So let's say you put a big tariff on electric cars from China. Electric cars from China. And let's assume in the United States we didn't have a mandate to move to electric cars. Well, the price of Chinese electric cars would go up dramatically. It would double in price. Maybe not double because there would be this adjustment of the currency, of the rate of exchange, and maybe it would go up by 50%, the cost. American companies couldn't compete with Chinese electric cars before. Now, they can match Chinese prices, and it's 50% more expensive. Americans now have a lot less money to spend on other things because they're spending 50% more on electric cars. And given the mandate, actually, the mandate makes it worse. They're forced to do it. They're forced to do it. Now, nobody benefits other than inefficient electric car manufacturers in the United States who can't compete and are now basically getting a boost to sales artificially through a tariff. Now, add to that the fact that tariffs create a hostile relationship. You're basically telling this other country, we don't want your goods, even though we know they're better than what we can produce here, which creates conflict, which can ultimately lead to war, which is part of my fear about China. Part of my fear about China is all this tariff talk, all this Cold War II talk, all this China as an enemy talk, all this World War III talk will lead us in the end to World War III. Whereas instead of that, we should be talking about how powerful our military is, how we should, all positive, how we will defend Taiwan, how as long as China is not free, we do not support the reunification, and we will do whatever it takes to make our economy and our military the strongest in the world. That should be the approach. Friend Hopper says Merry Christmas, or Merry Christmas Eve Day, something like that. Wyatt516 says, did Hunter's laptop show evidence of China's power? No, I don't think so. I mean, China basically tried to bribe Hunter, tried to bribe Biden, but Biden landed up being tougher on China than Trump ever was. So it doesn't seem like it helped. And it doesn't seem like they got what they wanted from the relationship. They're trying to, I'm sure they're trying to bribe and trying to get into the halls of power of the United States, just like we're trying to do for the same thing for China. But yeah, I mean, they're trying to do that. It doesn't show that they're particularly powerful. It doesn't show that they were successful. They weren't, as far as we can tell. Mindspan, given COVID-19, what should U.S. policy be in regarding biosafety level 4 virus institutions in nations like China, including foreign policy and research funds. Well, I mean, I think we need to be very, very careful about any kind of this kind of biological research, particularly in countries where we don't have control. Now, should we be doing gain-of-function research or not? I'll leave that for another time. But if we do that kind of research, we should be doing it in America. We shouldn't do it in a place where a foreign country that might be hostile to the U.S. could gain access to the research, and where maybe the safety protocols are not quite as rigorous as they would be in the U.S. So I would say we shouldn't be funding that kind of research in China. We probably shouldn't be funding that kind of research anywhere in the world. And whatever research like that we do, we should be doing in the United States. And we should be applying the most rigorous, highest standards of safety and security possible to that research. Christian, my brother lives in Hong Kong. Even if the extradition law is evil, he says that basically it is still the old city it was before. No end of freedom. Do you disagree? Yeah, I definitely disagree. I mean, you've given up the right for free speech. There's no free speech in Hong Kong. You try to write something against the government, you'll be arrested. You can't start a media company if that's your goal and ambition. And in that media company, you can't criticize the government. And it has to impact everything. It has to impact what people say in dinner parties and in cocktail parties. It has to impact what people say at work. You can't demonstrate. You can't express your opinion about something that they're doing that is wrong. There is a real clamping down on freedom. Also, a lot of people have left because they won't tolerate this. A lot of very good people have left. Ultimately, China now also controls the legal system. So it's not clear that Hong Kong has the rule of law. It's not clear that if you piss off a Chinese communist official, you can be prosecuted, I don't know, for some business-related law. So there is no freedom in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is as free as the Chinese bureaucracy allows it on any given in any given moment. And you are as free, as long as you don't piss off somebody in power who can then go after you. Again, the courts are not independent, and the rule of law is gone, done with, doesn't exist. So no, I completely disagree. Michael Sanders, are the haters just people who gave, wait a minute, I'm not going to do that yet. We'll get back to that. Raymond, are you supportive of Russian NATO when you don't support NATO? Also, why don't you think China can compete when they are already at parity PPP? So a few things. One is, given Russia's aggressiveness, I support NATO. I support a much smaller footprint for the United States in NATO. I think NATO should be primarily and predominantly a European alliance. I don't think the United States needs to be significantly involved, maybe not involved at all, because I think the Russian threat is small and a threat that if Europe was serious, it could take care of. Europe is rich, relatively free, has strong military, if it wants to have a strong military, and it can take care of it. There is nobody to take care of China. And China is a direct threat to American interests, to the shipping lanes in the Pacific, which are clearly part of America's interest, to the chip production in Taiwan, which is clearly in American interest. So while, again, I think any alliance in Asia needs to be grounded in the countries of Asia, but the fact is that Japan and South Korea and Australia cannot match up to China in the way that Germany, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Poland can match up against Russia. I forgot France, UK, right? So there is an option in NATO, that is Europe. There's no option in Asia. They're just not rich enough, big enough, strong enough to be able to confront China, and they need American support, and they should get it because America has vital interests there. So I am for an Asian NATO, and I'm for the United States basically reducing its involvement in NATO and Europe because Europe can take care of itself. It's big enough, strong enough. Why don't you think China can compete? It can't compete because it achieved parity PPP when it allowed its economy some freedom. And when you only allow for some economic freedom, you can grow very, very fast initially. But once you get to a certain level of economic success, you need a lot more freedom to grow further. And China's not allowing that. Quite the opposite. China's backtracking even on the little freedom it allowed in the past. So it is becoming less free. As China becomes less free, it will become, more challenged economically. It won't be able to compete. It can't compete right now. It's struggling dramatically right now, economically, and it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better. Because the remedy for Chinese problems is always centralized planning. And central planning reduces economic growth. It reduces competitiveness. It reduces innovation. So China can't compete because China is an authoritarian state. And the more authoritarian it becomes, and over the last 5-6 years it's become much more authoritarian, the less competitive it is, the less innovation they're going to be. Why should Asia confront China? Should Hispanic American confront the U.S.? No. The difference is that the United States is not a power trying to, by use of force, reduce the amount of freedom Latin Americans have. China is doing exactly that. It wants to take over free Taiwan and enslave it to Chinese authoritarian government. It wants to control the shipping lanes, not in order to increase freedom around Asia, but to decrease freedom, to put everybody under the thumb of the Chinese, thus decreasing individual freedom in all those countries. That is not what the United States does in Latin America. The United States, for good or for ill, is mostly trying to increase the freedom for Latin Americans. And therefore, Latin Americans not only shouldn't be fighting America, they should be thankful for most of what America does in the hemisphere. Eyal, how did the Algerian War influence the ideological development of early Palestinian movement? Wow. Later, right? Not that. Not that. Linda says there's a book called Freedom Forged by Arthur Hetman, who wrote The Cave in the Light. Yes, it's very good. It's about the buildup and of the industrial military capabilities of the United States before and during World War II, and how the United States just became this massive weapons manufacturer almost on a dime, really, really quickly. It's a fascinating book. Hetman is a good author. Okay, not relevant. Away, that's not relevant. Okay. All right, let's do unrelated questions. So I've got a bunch of those. Wes, thank you for the $50 sticker. Really, really appreciate that. RDF, thank you for the sticker. David Barker, thank you for the sticker. Let's see if there were other stickers that I missed. James, thank you. Stephen, thank you. Nevals, thank you. Jeremy, thank you. And if I caught up, no, David, yes, David, RDF. Okay, we're caught up with the stickers. Thank you guys for the sticker. Okay, let's go with questions unrelated to China. So draw a line to China, although you can still ask about China if you want. Let's see. Remo says, I'm sorry, I'm lagging behind. How would you deregulate finance so that we would see an increase in hostile takeovers? Well, the main thing there is to get rid of the 1968, which I didn't talk about. On the show the other day. There's so many things that we can talk about in terms of finance. But the 1968, I can't remember the name of the bill. Basically, that made that requires investors to disclose when they have 10%, 5%, and then 10% of a company. Where they, in order to take over a company, you have to do tender offers. You have to disclose it publicly. So all of those disclosure requirements, the 13 Fs and the 13 Ds, and I would scrap the whole 1968 law that basically constrains the ability of companies to take over other companies without public disclosure. And that would do it. And then I would also get rid of all the state laws, these are all state laws, that allow companies to allow companies to engage in all kinds of mischief in order to avoid a hostile takeover. But I think the main thing is the 68 law, because then everything else is mute, because if I can buy up 50% of your stock without letting anybody know and just buy it up in the open market and then show up one day and I'm in control. That's it. Don't need any other sophisticated laws. No poison pills, none of the things that companies do in order to protect themselves, because it's all done, without really happening. The Williams Act, thank you, the 1968 Williams Act. I would repeal that. As I said, you take financial laws, Williams Act being one of them, and you just repeal them one by one, starting with Dodd-Frank, going backwards, all the way to 1933. And there's probably some bills even before that you would get rid of. Michael, why are you going to stop doing shows when you're 75? Why not keep going to your 90s? Also, I have a ton of questions unrelated to China. I would like to save for your end of month AMA show. When will that be? Oh, Michael. I don't know. Did I say I'm going to stop doing shows at 75? Why are you even taking me seriously at that? I'll stop doing shows when I feel like either my mind is not sharp enough to do the shows, or I don't have enough energy to do the shows. I expect that at some point I'll do fewer shows. It's it's already, it's a lot of energy, it's a lot of time, it's a lot of effort required. So I would say that slowing down makes sense at some point, but I will keep doing something as long as it's fun, as long as it's interesting, as long as I have the energy, and as long as I think my mind is still sharp enough to be able to contribute something. In terms of AMA, the AMA is on Saturday, this coming Saturday. So what is it, the 28th? I think Saturday, the 28th, there'll be an AMA. So you can ask all the questions then. Liam, to what extent are people's psychological corruptions and insecurities preventing objectivism from latching on? I reject the idea that this philosophy is hard to understand. It makes people insecure, anxious due to their damaged psychologies. I think that's certainly part of it. I definitely think it's part of it. A lot of it is just lack of self-esteem. You need a lot of self-esteem to be able to and willing to say, I uphold a philosophy that nobody else agrees with. I stand for a philosophy that is a slap in the face to 2,000 years of Christianity. I am an atheist. I am an egoist. I am a capitalist. It takes self-esteem. They have confidence in your own mind and your own ability and your own psychology and your own self and you. And I think that is a big part of it. But part of the way people will gain self-esteem is by embracing the philosophy slowly, maybe not publicly initially, maybe it takes time. so I think I think there's certainly psychological barriers, but there's also the lack of knowledge of how to think, of reasoning capabilities, which also has psychological consequences, makes you, again, afraid and weak and lack of self-esteem. But there is just ignorance of the methodology. There's ignorance of history that makes adopting objectivism objectively hard. I don't think it's right to say that it's hard to that it's not hard to understand. I think it is hard to understand because it requires a context which I think a lot of people don't have. They don't have primarily because they have not engaged their mind. So it's philosophical and psychological. I don't think it's just, I don't think there's a primacy of psychology. Part of the reason they're psychologically screwed up is because they've embraced bad cognitive habits, bad cognitive ideas. And altruism, it's difficult to understand why it's wrong. And it's difficult to understand how everybody could be wrong. Every philosopher in history, with the exception of Aristotle, how could they all be wrong? Drin, can Ukraine win without bombing Russian territory heavily? Should they get the right to strike inside Russia? How can Ukraine win its lost territory? Yes, they should have definitely been allowed to strike within Russia from the beginning. They have the permission to do some of that today, but it's all still constrained. It shouldn't be. I mean, the way Ukraine can win, it's they would need, they would need the weapon systems that the West has promised them. They would need them now. They would need them in quantity. I don't know where all the F-16s are. I don't know if they've been deployed. I don't know if they're in the air. I don't know if they're functioning. I don't know what's constraining them. I have a feeling when they gave them the F-16s, they gave them an old model with fewer missiles and fewer electronic defenses from air defense systems and all the rest of it. If they got the weapon systems, what they ultimately need is a strategy for how to advance into territory that the Russians have captured, given the Russians invested so heavily in landmines and other defenses to stop Ukrainian advancing. So they would need mine clearing equipment. They would need air support. They would need the capabilities to basically shut down the Russians. It's hard because they lack the manpower, and it's a little disappointing that you don't have more volunteers in the Ukrainian army. That the Ukrainian army is not growing more internally from Ukrainians who volunteer. Michael says, are haters just people who gave up on their goals and are bothered you didn't? Maybe. I'm not sure that explains everything, but it's certainly part of it. It's certainly part of it. It's people who are envious for a variety of reasons. People who resent you because they lack self-esteem, because they lack the confidence to pursue their goals, because they resent that you have self-esteem and you are pursuing goals. Eyal. How did the Algerian War influence the ideological development of the early Palestinian movement? Well, I think it convinced the early Palestinian movement that they could win against the colonizing power. It led them to believe that Israel was like France, a European colonizer, and that if they just sustained their efforts, they could kick the Jews back to Europe, just like the French abandoned Algeria and left. And they've never conceptualized the real differences between the Jewish commitment to Israel, the fact that the Jews don't have anywhere to go, the fact that they don't come from anywhere in a sense, or anywhere that will accept them back, including Arab countries, by the way. and that they're not colonizers, they're builders, they're creators. And they created a nation, built a nation, and that they're just not going to give it up. They're not going to give it up. And that in that sense, their fight is hopeless. But Algeria gave them the sense that no, if they can beat France, we can beat the Israelis, we can beat these Jews. Supik asks, why do pessimists often say they're realists? Well, because everybody wants to pretend that they're realists, right? Everybody wants to say, I'm not just letting emotions guide myself. This is what really is. This is based on reality. Bad things happen. So, I think it's partially to convince themselves that they're realistic, that this is based on facts, that it's not just emotion. And to convince us, of course. Harper Campbell, is the first step to destroying society making art ugly? That's why the left has been posting pictures with unattractive models with green hair and disgusting statues depicting nothing. God, I don't know if it's a first step. It might be the other way around. It might be that once a culture is destroyed, the art gets ugly, or it might be hand in hand, or it might sometimes come before. But I also don't think there's an implication here that the left wants to destroy the culture, therefore it's making ugly art. And I don't think it works that way. I don't think they think in terms of we want to destroy the culture. They have ideas that are destructive to the culture. The ideas lead to bad art or ugly art, or it's not even art, but something that looks like art that's ugly. Part of what they do is they empty the concept of art from all content, and then they go ahead and produce this ugly stuff that is empty, that is meaningless. They promote a meaningless, ugly, empty philosophy. It all goes hand in hand. And the consequence, whether they like it or not, is the destruction of the culture. Jim, ban any government funding of any program in higher education. Yeah, or lower education for that matter. Separation of state from education should be in the Constitution. Separation of state from education. I vote for that as a constitutional amendment. Mark, hi, Yaron. Away from show due to startup work, what are the prospects for objectivist activities next year? Want to share some ideas with you and ARI. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on. I think next year, ARU is expanding, and there'll be a lot of new things being announced, a lot of conferences. I mentioned the one in Austin a little while ago, and a lot more to come. I'll be traveling a lot, giving speeches, doing the show, doing other things. I'm teaching. I'm teaching a class in finance. I'm teaching a bunch of different, I'm teaching like 3-4 different courses this year. A course in capitalism with Don Watkins, all at ARU. Anonymous though, I have a show idea for you. Post a number or Zoom chat link and ask the random people of the internet to come debate you. Charge a fee for access. God, I can only imagine who's going to show up. It's going to be pretty obnoxious. Interesting. I'll think about that. Yeah, it's a good idea. It could be pretty disastrous instead of the quality of people. What's the objectivist critique of Lenin's market socialist theory? God, I mean, that requires a whole show. But, I mean, Lenin doesn't really have a market socialist theory. Basically his solution to the fact that socialism leads to economic destruction and the destruction of productive capabilities is to allow a little bit of market phenomena for a while so as to resurrect kind of the economy, and then shut it down when it becomes too significant and substantial. But I don't know that there's a real theory there. But any form of socialism doesn't work and is morally harmful. But, you know, maybe when I have Nikos on to talk about leftist theories, you can ask that of Nikos, because he's good on really knowing what these Marxists held. Okay, Andrew, it looks like the last question. Foreign policy involves morality. I wouldn't say altruism is driving our approach to China. More like a short-term, concrete-bound nationalistic approach to self-interest that's false. Thoughts? I mean, it's a combination of some altruism. It's why we're not very self-assertive. And a short-term, pragmatic, concrete-bound, pseudo-nationalistic, but I wouldn't say self-interest, approach that is pseudo-self-interest, but is all, it's complete pragmatism with no ideology behind it. So again, this book I'm reading by one of the more intelligent appointees to the Defense Department, he basically says, it doesn't matter if China's free or unfree, they're a threat to us either way. That's just wrong. Wrong. Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with what you're saying. There's elements of altruism which prevent us from asserting ourselves, from calling them, the authoritarians that they are and making a moral judgment about that. Altruism is what holds us back on all that. All right, guys, thank you. I appreciate the support from the Super Chatters. Thank you for all of you involved. Thank you for Alex Epstein for sponsoring this show. I hope you enjoyed it. I don't think you'll get quite this level of analysis anywhere else on the China issue. I mean, the books and stuff, but then the quality is not that good. It might be detailed, but it won't be right. Yeah, if you have any further questions on China, send them along or bring them up in a future show. Those of you who are not on live, if you have questions about China, come on the New Year's Eve show and ask those as your Super Chat questions. All right, everybody, I will see you tomorrow, normal time. I think 2 p.m. East Coast time tomorrow. And then it'll be Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, and we'll take some time off. Bye, everybody.